Now, I want to get into the actual story of your new novel in some detail, but before that, I want to talk about the actual historical document that inspired this book, the Book of Negroes. Tell me about what this thing is.
Well, when the Americans and the British were fighting in the American Revolutionary War, the British tried to wrestle up assistance from black slaves to help them fight the Americans. And the British were still, of course, hoping to win that Revolutionary War and suppress the American uprising. And so they put out a call, a formal call, to blacks to flee their plantations, to flee their slave owners, and to come fight for the British or serve the British, not just fight as soldiers, but serve them as cooks, laundresses, road builders, all sorts of things. And the blacks that had served the British in the war were told that in exchange for serving us, we will set you free, we'll take care of you. And so when the war came to an end, and the blacks found that they'd been serving on the losing side of the American Revolutionary War, they were naturally terrified that they'd be retaken by their former owners. Thousands of them had come to New York City, settled in Manhattan, which was the last enclave that the British controlled in the United States. And at the end of the war, the British arranged for the blacks who had served them to be shipped out from the Hudson River, Manhattan, to Nova Scotia. Some of them went to Quebec, some of them went to England and Germany, but the overwhelming majority went to Nova Scotia, 3,000 or so. And so the Book of Negroes was a document, a historical ledger penned by the British, in which the names of the blacks who wanted to leave had to be listed.
And it still exists. It is a physical document.
Yes, there are copies of it in various forms, microfiche, whatever, in the National Archives, in the Nova Scotia Public Archives, and in the National Archives in the UK as well.
Now, this is a very sweeping historical novel saga that takes us from Africa to South Carolina to New York City to Nova Scotia, back to Africa, and then to London. And that some people who have read it so far have said this is a journey into the heart of slavery. What drew you to this particular subject, this particular point in time?
What drew me to it? Well, I was fascinated by the idea that some of the people who'd come to Canada to seek their freedom, having been slaves in the United States, actually returned to Africa, some of whom had been born in Africa. And
which is historically accurate. I mean, there was a movement back to Africa.
Yes, indeed, the very first back to Africa movement in the history of the Americas came from Canadian shores, from Halifax, 1792, 1,200 men, women and children. So I was drawn to the idea of a back and forth journey across the ocean. And in all the books I've read about the black experience in Canada and in the States, and in all the novels that I've read or read when I was growing up in Don Mills, Ontario, I never found a story that reached into the details of life in Africa before abduction, brought a slave across the ocean in a vessel, set them up in the US and then Canada, and then sent them back home. So that back and forth across the ocean thing is something I haven't really come across in a novel about the black experience in, say, the 18th century before.
Well, let's talk about that experience, because the central fictional figure is an African woman,
She is.
Aminata, who is kidnapped as a child, sold into slavery. Tell me about her life before captivity.
Well, she lives in a village in the country that's now known as Mali. That wasn't then known as Mali. She's born in 1745. The Muslim influence has begun to penetrate the part of West Africa and Mali that she's living in. It's not a total penetration, but it's a gradual penetration, and with that comes literacy. Timbuktu, which is a huge center of Muslim scholarship, is not too terribly far away. And she's been exposed to the idea of reading and writing in Arabic before she is abducted. And so this fascination with language. Her mother speaks one language, her father speaks another, then there's Arabic, which is a language of writing. These things are planted in her head before she's abducted, and so she wants to learn, and she decides that the only way she can survive and maybe one day get home is to learn the ways of the white man, is to learn how to read and write and sort of excel on their level, so that if she can understand the world, maybe she can leave it. So sort of self-education and learning is what keeps her alive and it keeps her motivated.
And that occurs throughout the life. But first, Aminata is sold to an indigo plantation owner. How does her life change at that point?
Well, she's got to learn some skills to make herself valuable. She has to learn how to work in an indigo plantation, how to cultivate indigo and turn it into the mud that's used to dye the uniforms of British soldiers and others. And she learns to apply her midwife skills in South Carolina.
And she's useful as a consequence.
She's useful, and she knows that if she's useful, she has more chance of surviving and of learning what she needs to know, and she wants to learn to read.
She finds her way to New York, and abetted by a black tavern owner.
Yes.
She basically escapes.
She does.
Into a very interesting part of New York, again, the nature of which I have no background on it at all. Tell me more about that.
New York was such a fascinating place in the mid-1770s as the American Revolutionary War is beginning. For one thing, it's chaos. People are arriving all over the place. The blacks that are arriving have no place to stay, and so they set up camp in this place called Canvas Town, which is called Canvas Town because old, useless sails ripped from ships that are no longer functional are used as canvas to construct these little shanty tents, kind of like a tent city, but in Manhattan, in late 1770s and early 1780s. The British, for the most part, rule Manhattan. Manhattan is the last British stronghold in the American Revolutionary War, so naturally, huge numbers of blacks flee to Manhattan because they want to escape the circumstances in which they found themselves before, slavery or the threat of slavery. And so Aminata survives there also by being a midwife to the British who have their mistresses whose babies need to be caught, and by working in a tavern run by this free black tavern owner, a real place called the Francis Tavern. At the end of the war, the British, who have promised the blacks that they'll be protected and made equal after the war, are sent largely to Nova Scotia. And of course, they're delighted to go. They're desperate to get out. They've got their names registered in the Book of Negroes, that British document, and off they go in many, many ships over a course of many months in 1783 from Manhattan to Nova Scotia. They settle
the Promised Land, and they're told this is a promise. Freedom at last.
Absolutely.
This portrayal, I think, is probably the most different from the historical stories that I was told about what happened to the black migration of loyalists to Nova Scotia in this period.
Well, look, I mean, we're Canadians, and we like to mythologize our history, I think, in ways that are sometimes self-serving. And we know generally about the Underground Railroad and about the movement of blacks into Canada to find their freedom or their promised land, but this is another aspect to the story. And the blacks who came to Nova Scotia, for the first part, they were not all free. A number of them were enslaved. A number of them were
They
slaves.
came up with their British loyalist owners.
They were slaves of British loyalist officers, and they traveled to Nova Scotia from Manhattan as slaves of these British officers, and they remained enslaved in Nova Scotia, some of them. Others came free, and others came indentured, which was sort of a purgatory, a halfway ground between slavery and freedom. So it was a very, very hard time. And for proof of that allegation, all you have to do is look at the fact that 10 years later, the blacks that had any social mobility at all, the ones who were not indebted, who were not indentured, and who were not enslaved, were given the opportunity by the British government to leave, and they did.
And the British government actually incorporates the Sierra Leone Company.
It does.
For this particular purpose, of taking blacks back to Africa.
Exactly. The British government incorporates the company. They have the legal authority to move these blacks into Africa and legal control over them when they come to Africa. And it brings 1,200 black men, women, and children to Sierra Leone to start a new colony.
Including Aminata.
Including Aminata, who goes with them from Halifax to Sierra Leone. So there you go, back and forth.
So this Freetown.
Freetown
is not a paradise either, though.
No, it's not a paradise. And again, in certain ways, the blacks from Nova Scotia, formerly from the United States, and some of them formerly from Africa, were betrayed in Africa too. They had the same sorts of struggles in Freetown that they'd had in Halifax and in other parts of Nova Scotia. They had bickering about taxation issues. They didn't get the land that they were promised. absolutely they did not get the land they were promised, and they had a number of struggles about their own political autonomy. But it was free, and they were not re-enslaved. And slowly over time they carved out a place for themselves, and they slowly became the people who are now known as Sierra Leoneans.
It's historical fiction, but I get the sense that the story is relevant today in your view.
I hope so. I hope so. I mean, the story of women and the struggle of women around the world and the loss of their children is certainly, I would hope, relevant at any times. The story of slavery is not really over. Slavery continues to this day in more complicated fashions. Children all around the world, we all know that there are children who are forced to work, who are effectively enslaved in all sorts of parts of the world, and other people who are forced to work in hideous circumstances that are tantamount to a modern-day slavery. So I hope that it's not just seen as a historical novel. I hope that one reading it feels that there is a connection to today. I certainly believe that there is.
Lawrence Hill, I want to thank you very much for joining me. It's been a great pleasure as always.
Thank you.